All right, back in the basement again today to talk about the age-old question of which size thickness of belt should you get, 10 millimeters or 13 millimeters. Those are by far the most popular, especially when it comes to things like powerlifting. And surprisingly enough, it's not just a 3 millimeter difference. In fact, in some instances, it might actually be up to a 7 millimeter difference between the two belts. So in this video, we're gonna talk about exactly what goes into a powerlifting belt and how thick it actually is.
Today's video is brought to you by Skillshare, which is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for creators. Explore new skills, deepen existing passions, and get lost in creativity. It's curated specifically for learning, meaning there's no ads and they're always launching new premium classes, so you can stay focused and follow wherever your creativity takes you. Skillshare has tons of topics including illustration, design, photography, video, freelancing, and more. In fact, I used a video called YouTube Success, Script, Shoot, and Edit with MKBHD to help me come up with the lead-in intro to this particular video you're watching right now. Skillshare is offering a special promotion to the first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link on the description, and you'll get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare so you can start exploring your creativity today.
All right, in today's video, we're gonna focus on 10 millimeters versus 13 millimeters for belts. Those are the most popular belt choices and what's generally available when we take a look at any manufacturer out there. Now, if you like this video, please like it, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I can make more videos in this series breaking down belts, talking about things like prong or lever or some of the adjustability options out there. We can really get freaky when it comes to leather and belts and lifting. In order to better understand, though, the differences between a 10 and a 13 millimeter and why it's not really 3 millimeters, though, is we have to kind of go behind the scenes just a little bit. Now, generally speaking, when we take a look at any powerlifting focused belt out there, it's going to be made from leather and or suede. So it might be a full leather belt or a combination of suede, and I'll reference that in this video quite a bit. So when I talk about full leather, that means the only material for thickness is leather. If I talk about a single layer of suede, which typically is on the inside of the belt, and then the leather would be on the outside, or a double layer of suede, which would have suede on the inside and on the outside, sandwiching a layer of leather. I'm gonna be referencing those 3 types of belts in this video because it can really make a big difference in the actual thickness of your belt. So what do I mean by that? Well, when we take a look at leather, it's generally only available in sizes up to a 7.5 or 8 millimeter thickness. And even then, it's harder to get that kind of quantity. And it's also harder to get in terms of price. It's more expensive because it's not as readily available. Again, we're dealing with a material that doesn't have a consistent thickness or availability. So it's really depending on what's available on the market. And for the most part, most manufacturers will use leather up to 6.5 millimeters of thickness because, again, they don't want to have to worry about sourcing material. And more importantly, they don't want to have to worry about turning that cost either onto you or taking a hit in their actual overall margins as their price of materials increases. So 6.5 millimeters is usually the thickest piece of leather you'll find from most manufacturers out there. Now that should get your brain turning a little bit. If they're only using a 6.5 millimeter thickness of leather, how does someone get a 10 millimeter belt? How does someone get a 13 millimeter belt? How do some companies like Inzer claim that they're only using a single layer of leather? Well, we'll break it down a little bit in this video. And again, it really comes down to which belt you choose here. Now, because we're only dealing with up to a 6.5 millimeter belt thickness for leather, let's take a look at a 10 millimeter full leather belt. So no suede material involved. The only way to get to that full 10 millimeters of leather is going to be by adding 2 pieces together. That might be a 5 and a 5, a 6 and a 4, any 2 combinations of numbers that's going to get you a round 10 millimeters. So you're not gonna get 10 on the dot in most cases. It might be a little bit less, it might be a little bit more. Again, with the material we're working with, it's not something that's consistent or man-made where you're going to get that same thickness through and through. So 10 millimeter leather belt is going to be 2 pieces of leather glued together. Now, when we go to a single layer of suede belt, which again, typically you'll find it on the inside and leather being on the outside. That number 1 takes a little bit of thickness away. Each layer of suede can account for about 2 millimeters of overall thickness, meaning that for a 10 millimeter belt with a single layer of suede, we only really need 8 millimeters of leather. It's still going to require 2 pieces glued together, but in this case, it might be a 4 and a 4, a 5 and a 3, whatever the case may be. And that other layer of suede on the inside, which is also done because suede is more comfortable against the skin than full-on leather. Now, when it comes to a double suede belt, again, because the thickness of leather used by manufacturers is usually around 6.5 millimeters, if we're accounting for 2 layers of suede at 4 millimeters each, we can get away with using a single piece of leather. And in fact, if you take a look at Inzer's website, the one who advertises that they only use single pieces of leather in their belts, that really only applies to their 10 millimeter double suede belt. Because again, there's no possible way to get leather thicker than that to actually make it a 10 or 13 millimeter belt. And if you have a 13 millimeter belt from Inzer, you can actually take a look and you can usually find the seam where those pieces of leather were glued together. So that kind of gets 10 out of the way. When we get to the 13 millimeter belt, it's really similar, right? If we're going to be going full leather, 13 millimeters, it's two pieces of leather glued together, a 6 and a 7, a 7 and a 5.5, whatever two numbers you can think of, probably going to be a 6 and a 7. I'm not a math major, don't blame me for that. But again, no way around two pieces of leather, regardless if you go full leather, single, or double suede. So in the single suede instance, again, each layer of suede, 2 millimeters, which means we need 11 millimeters of leather and 2 millimeters of suede. So again, some combination that adds up to 11, 5, and 6. A single layer of suede, boom, 13 millimeters. For the double layer of suede here, 2 layers of suede at 2 millimeters each, that's 4 millimeters total. We need 9 millimeters of leather altogether. Again, can't get that in a single piece, 5 and a 4, whatever the case may be, to add up to that 9 millimeters required, okay? So what I wanna call out here is there's a significant difference between all of these belts. So let's take the polar opposites. Full leather 13 millimeter has 13 millimeters of leather versus a 10 millimeter double suede belt, which I think is the most popular belt that most people end up getting. This one has 13 millimeters of leather. This one has 6.5 millimeters of leather. So this belt is going to be twice as stiff, sturdy, rigid, hard to break in. There is a big difference between these two. Now, when I take a look at a 10 millimeter leather belt versus a 10 millimeter double suede belt, you're still dealing with about 4 millimeters in difference in terms of leather, which is a significant amount. Again, 6 millimeters to 10, almost double the amount of leather. So even if you're looking at 10 millimeters, how stiff you want that belt is really going to vary, again, depending on if you're going full leather, which is going to give you that full 10 millimeters, a single layer of suede, which is going to give you an 8 millimeter thickness of leather, or a 10 millimeter double suede, which is only around 6 millimeters of leather. There's a good variance between all three. Now, when we take a look at the actual 13 millimeter belts, again, it depends on the levels you break down. So with the stiffest being full leather at 13 millimeters, a single layer of suede being 11 millimeters of leather, 2 millimeters of suede, or a 13 millimeter double suede, which is going to be 9 millimeters of leather, 4 millimeters of suede. So in that case, we're still dealing with 4 millimeters difference between the softest 13 millimeter to the stiffest 13 millimeter, which again, is still more significant than that 3 millimeters that you would think on the surface of just comparing a 10 to a 13. What I think is really interesting, however, though, is if you take a look at some of these offerings where you could have a 13 millimeter double suede, again being 9 millimeters of leather, 4 millimeters of suede, and compare that to a 10 millimeter full leather, which is actually going to give you more leather overall and thus actually be stiffer. So you could have a 10 millimeter that's stiffer than a 13 millimeter belt, but again, it really depends on which finish you decide to go with. Now, as far as I go and my opinions for most people, I kind of stick to the story of the 10 millimeter double suede is the best for most people. It's going to be the most comfortable. It's going to be the one that's going to give you a lot of support, not as much support as something that has more layers of leather, because again, we're dealing with roughly 6 to 6.5 millimeters of leather here. But more is not always more in this scenario, because if you go to the opposite end of the spectrum and go 13 millimeters, full leather belt, it will hurt you. I've had this belt for about 2 years. I think I've worn it about twice. It takes forever to break in. You can just tell by how these belts are laying right here on this board. This one still has a full life left into it, where all these other ones a little bit more pliable. I don't recommend this to hardly anyone. For most people, a 10 millimeter double suede is perfect, or even a 13 millimeter double suede, because in reality, again, you're only getting that 9 millimeters of leather, which isn't as stiff as a 10 millimeter full-on leather belt. So hopefully now you know a little bit more about belts. I've probably confused you more about which one to get, but at least now you can make a more informed decision going forward. If you have any questions on this, leave them in the comment section below. But in the meantime, as always, thanks for watching and stay big.